Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jordan Stein. I work as a curator of public programs at Caddist in San Francisco, and welcome to the fourth installment of our Ketchup Sessions. The premise is really simple, yet compelling and very Caddist. We invite a curator that we know and love to choose two artists that they know and love who likely don't know each other, but have a lot in common and have likely never shown in exhibitions together, to get together here in Zoom, give a short presentation about new or recent work, and then have a dialogue with each other, facilitated by the curator. We're lucky to be joined today by Brooke Andrew and Mariana Castillo Deball, hosted by Ivan Muñiz Reed. Brooke is joining us from Italy, where he's on residency. Mariana is in Mexico City, where she's installing an exhibition, and Ivan is in Hawaii, where he's making a nice life. So it's a very international situation today. And I just want to let you know that this event is being live captioned. There's a little button that says CC at the bottom of the Zoom. Hit that for captioning. The format of today's event is that Brooke and Mariana will give short presentations. Mariana's actually going to walk us a little bit through this exhibition in State of Becoming, which is totally exciting. And then a conversation and a Q&A. So we'll be fomenting questions throughout the course of the event today and submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I want to quickly let you know about the next Ketchup session, which is on the 21st of October, hosted by Fernanda Brenner, with Ana Vaz and Beatriz Santiago Munoz, which will be fantastic. And it's co-presented with Pivo, arts organization in Sao Paulo. All past Ketchup sessions are online, and you can see documentation there. And I want to thank Aaron Turney behind the scenes for making this happen, the captioner, and my Caddist colleagues for ensuring that this run smoothly. I'll just tell you a little bit about Ivan, and then I'll hand the mic to him. He's an independent curator, a writer, a researcher, and a specialist in Australian and Latin American practices, and especially decolonial perspectives across the global South. He's worked on a number of projects with Caddist, and we're really lucky to count him as a friend and a collaborator. So without further ado, I'll pass things to Ivan, and thanks everybody for joining us, and stick around through the Q&A.
Thank you, Jordan. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jordan, and thank you to Caddist for inviting me to do this. You know, I love collaborating with Caddist. And thank you for making this space, allowing us to bring these two really remarkable artists together. I'm really beyond excited. So I'm here in Oahu, in Hawaii. So before I get started, I did want to acknowledge Hawaii as an indigenous space. And I also want to recognize past and present generations of Native Hawaiians, and how with their knowledge systems, they shape the islands sustainably, which means that we can all enjoy this beautiful land. And I'm personally very thankful for the time I've spent here with my family. So yeah, it is my special job today to introduce our two amazing guest speakers. It's a bit of like a blind date, like Jordan was saying, and I'm the awkward third wheel. But I'll start by introducing Mariana Castillo Deball, who, as Jordan mentioned, she's joining us from Mexico City, from the University Museum of Contemporary Art, where she's installing, and we're going to get a sneak peek of her work. She's an absolutely brilliant artist. She is from Mexico originally, based in Berlin. She's also a brilliant thinker and a writer and an editor. We haven't had the chance to work together. Maybe when the world goes back to normal, we might do that. I don't know. Lucky if I'm lucky. But we met through Caddist when she was launching a publication for one of her projects with the San Francisco Art Institute. And in terms of her work, if you're not familiar with her work, she's often described as having a practice that is almost like a kaleidoscope, which I think is a better description than saying she's interdisciplinary, because she really engages with a huge amount of bodies of knowledge beyond the visual arts. So she you know, sciences and literature and indigenous language and culture, and it's really just a very deep and careful research that she does with the aim of trying to investigate historical objects and the records of historical objects and how these objects describe the world. So thank you, Mariana, for joining us. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Brooke Andrew, who is a preeminent Australian artist. He's also a scholar. He's also a curator. I've actually had the luck to work with him in his capacity as a curator at an exhibition at the MCA in Sydney, which is nearly about 10 years ago. So I don't know how that makes you feel, Brooke. It doesn't make me feel great. But look, I got my lucky charm, the catalog, which my 2-year-old daughter is weirdly obsessed with, mainly because it's like nice and cushy and chicken chew on the edges. But he also recently curated the Sydney Biennial, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney. He was the first Aboriginal curator of the Sydney Biennale, and it was a Biennale that was artist-led and First Nations-led. And if you don't know his practice, he is an artist who often incorporates elements of his heritage that traces back to his matrilineal Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal kinship. Or you might have seen some of his museum interventions where he juxtaposes old and new material and plays with collections in order to bring out colonial narratives on one hand, but also on the other hand to be a platform for narratives that maybe have been hidden or invisibilized or inferiorized. So we are very lucky to welcome these two amazing artists. And I just wanted to say, in terms of why I thought of this pairing, I mean, I just think they have such a strong synergy. They have so many things in common, and I think you know, you both have created a whole vocabulary around thinking of the archive, thinking of the historical record, and really bringing those two things into question. Questioning the relationship between the objects and truth, how we perceive truth, and how these dominant narratives make their way into our everyday lives and identities. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to pass on to Brooke, invite Brooke and Mariana to talk about their recent projects, recent ideas, which, like John said, will be followed by a discussion, and there'll be time for questions towards the end. So maybe I'll start with you, Brooke, if that sounds okay.
Sure. It's great to see everyone here. Thank you. For Jordan and Eden, and also yourself, Ivan and Mariana. It's really lovely to meet you here. And I think I might just, you know, start off talking about my practice at the moment. And you're right, of course, Ivan, and we worked together 10 years ago on Taboo, which was a really interesting space for me, because as an artist, I mean, you know, for an artist to be called a curator is a very weird thing for us. But you know, these are kind of forced terminologies, and it's an interesting thing to begin with, because terminologies, and also in Wiradjuri language or Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal language, you know, we don't really have these terminologies apart from something like Kalamadain is someone who's, you know, conducts a ceremony in traditional Aboriginal society, which is, of course, my mother's matrilineal line, but I'm very kind of invested in restitution and repatriation of cultural objects and working with source communities, and how that, of course, you know, kind of affects the way in which that I work with my own arts practice in regards to museums, you know, creating interventions, I suppose, into those spaces. But I think one thing I've been very much involved in at the moment is this thing about terminology, and decolonial is the big word, which is, of course, came out of Walter Manolo and others in you know, Latin America. And I was reading a little bit more about him in my recent research, and he talks about how Native Americans it's all about wisdom, and Europeans in the States is about science. And of course I don't agree with that, because we also, Indigenous people in Australia, had science, we had architecture, we had many things. So I think that this thing around terminology, even though people are really trying to kind of level out this playing field, it's very problematic for us. And so often we're in these spaces that are quite traumatic, but also inspiring. And I know Mariana's work very well, and I'm so grateful to be having this conversation, because it's not often that we can be in this space, and also with yourself, Ivan, to kind of talk about these things that are really safe spaces in a way. Sometimes they're unsafe spaces, and I'm very lucky to be up here and be part of a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship in Bellagio. It's beautiful, the people are really wonderful. And but also it's complicated. I was speaking with someone the other day, and they said, oh, I love the primitive art of Aboriginal people, and I know their well-being, but unfortunately today we're still loaded with these terminologies that are very complicated. So in saying that, I'd like to share a few images of third year and master's students I've been working with at the Victorian College of the Arts at the University of Melbourne on a theatre script I've written called Gaban. And Gaban means strange in my mother's language. And the way in which terminology, language, I suppose I just want to tell a little story. And Ivan, I know we've only got about 7 minutes each or something, because then we're going to open it up and have this great conversation. So please do be very physical about telling me to stop. The interesting thing about writing this theatre script for me was about being in the museum space. So working with the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, working with, very early on in my career, a young artist, 26, being in the UK, working with the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. So really that kind of kicked it off. And then I've worked with the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, also with the Ethnographic Museum in Madrid, the Musée de Quebranli, etc. And, some of these spaces are mixed contemporary art and museological spaces. So the kind of people that, as an artist I work with, they have a sense of power as far as the artist has agency to do what we want. Others, the anthropologists I'm working with, they may not have as much power, so therefore I end up creating these kind of propositions for exhibitions that unfortunately are not fulfilled because of building codes, or because there are certain ways in which cultural objects can be positioned. And as an Indigenous Celtic person, finding my, family's objects or even human remains in these spaces is very complicated. And then to be told that, we can or cannot position them the way we would like to, create those narratives is also really convoluted and can be distressing. And so Gaban, really the theatre script was a space that I wanted to create for myself, where I could use my own language, as in my Wiradjuri language, as well as imbue it with a sense of healing, or Nankari, as Pitjantjatjara people call it, and a place where there could be a different narrative, a different outcome. And so in this image here at the moment, the figure in the middle is called Photo or Budang. And Photo, really, that character represents the millions of photographs of Indigenous and other peoples through mainly the colonial period, for instance, through Enlightenment. Of course, not only the representation through etching, but then of course the invention of photography of Indigenous and people of color, colonized people. And so this character, Budang, is really the personification of that character, or of the kind of the kind of the weight of that history. And I think that the word primitivism comes to mind, and I think that these words and these terms are very heavy, and I think that they're problematic. And so really the script was a way in which, of course, I could discover different ways for Photo to have power. Even though that Photo here is a woman, all of the characters were non-gendered. Even though, for example, the woman sitting down on the right-hand side is the tree Gulani. It's a tree, I should say, sorry, and the name for tree is a Wiradjuri word. And the trees are very important for us, especially in Wiradjuri Gamilaroi countries in Western New South Wales, because the carved tree, or the marara, which is the marara Gulani, the carved tree, have very important place within men's business. And there are trees, 4 trees overseas, one in the Pitt Rivers Museum, 2 in the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, and 1 in Basel in a museum. And just to kind of return these trees back to our communities is very complicated. And the source communities, my own community, have very complicated stories around how we can actually be involved in the reality of not only their return back to our country or countries, there are over 300 different Aboriginal nations, but also what are they meaning? You know, can women look at them now, et cetera, et cetera. There's a character called Museum, which is a center stage here. He looks more like a kind of circus, leader or something like this. But this is just one of his personifications in this context. And then you'll see 2 people sitting down on their knees, and they're called public. And so the public as characters are really there to kind of assess the situation. And I suppose that in my art installations and also my photographs and collages, which I won't show tonight, they often struggle with this kind of perception. What is the character of museum? Who has the power? Who is the public? Does the public have power? Etc. This character here is called, in English, evidence, and it really represents the many human remains or skulls that I've, or porcelain representations of skulls that I've seen in museums. And this one specifically relates to the human remains collection at the University of Vienna. I've had the wonderful collaboration with the local artist Katharina Matiasek there, who was, like many of us, researched by the University of Vienna to work with the Austrian government and the Australian government to look at the Aboriginal human remains in the anthropologic collection to return or, kind of repatriate that. So really Gaban is a kind of a collection of not only my artist practice, my personal practice, my meeting other people and then connecting them to source communities. But in a way, it's this kind of this fantasy where I could maybe imagine a better outcome, so to speak. And here we have evidence released. So in the middle, you see evidence, and then here evidence is released. And evidence is a powerful object, and I often talk about certain objects that are imbued with power that many different people have when they see objects, regardless if they're Indigenous or not, I have to say, because I've known in non-Indigenous people to see Indigenous objects and want to talk to them, and and they give them answers. And I know that some of my other Indigenous friends from Brazil and even myself and other people have spoken to objects from our country, and they speak to us and we speak back to them. So really evidence is the power of that. And then the person standing on the left with the gun, that character's name is called Massacre, and it's actually taken from a letter from 1854 in the Snowy Mountain region of Victoria and Australia, which talks about a man called James Dixon, which is a real letter that talks about a massacre. And so, that they wrote back to England. And there are many, many, many other characters and many layers. But I think I might just stop there, because I just thought this was a great example to kind of, bring my whole kind of different artist practice and connections together.
Thank you, Brooke. It's amazing to see this different side. I've never seen you working on a play before. It's very, very exciting. I look forward to seeing it sometime. So maybe now, thanks so much for that. We'll move on to Mariana. Mariana, are you there? Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the Yeah, I also didn't know these works from you, and they're really amazing. Well, as Ivan mentioned, I'm now installing an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art from the university in Mexico City. It's an exhibition called Amaranthus. I'm doing it together with Catalina Lozano. It's a curator based here in Mexico City. We have been working on the project already for many years, and it's finally coming up together. And well, luckily we are now in production, and I wanted to share with you the process of a piece that I'm working at the moment together with Cooperación Comunitaria. It's an association that it's working all over Mexico on construction projects, environmental projects, and also community engaged enterprises that try to improve the local construction techniques to help, for example, in the case of earthquakes or major climate disasters, to help the community to organize, to find more economical solutions, ecological solutions. And so the whole story started in another museum, in a museum in Germany, which is called the Humboldt Forum. It's a museum that it's now almost finished. It's already opened, a part of the museum. And I started working on a piece for that museum based on a document that Humboldt brought from Mexico to Germany in the 19th century. It's called the Códice Humboldt, fragment 2, Códice Asoyu Reverso. And why it has two names, it's because Humboldt brought the first parts of the document, but he didn't know that there was another part of the document that stayed actually in Mexico. And the second part of the document stayed there until the 1940s, when it was found by an anthropologist from the Institute of Anthropology and History. And he purchased, or he took this document from the community in Guerrero. And it's now at the library of the National Museum of Anthropology. So it's one document that is divided in two libraries. One library is in Berlin, in Germany, and the other library is in Mexico City. But the original place where this document was done has none of these fragments. So when I finished when I was working on the piece for the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, I also thought that it would be important to approach the community in the region of Guerrero in Tlapa to see if they have knowledge of this document and to see if I could somehow bring this piece to that environment. And that's when I got in touch with Cooperación Comunitaria. They work specifically in this area, in the area of Malinaltepec in Guerrero, it's in the north. And I proposed them to make a version of the piece that I did for the museum in Berlin, but in the context of a series of centers to train teachers in the indigenous language of that region, which is called Mepa. And now I'm gonna switch my camera so I show you some of the details of what we are actually doing. Yeah, okay. I hope that the connection doesn't break, but it's a work made out of clay with fibers of different kinds, and also basically this codex, it's a tribute list, and it's basically what the people from Tlapa needed to pay to the Aztec Empire before the Spanish conquest. So at that time, the Mexica Empire and the Triple Alliance was very, very, very powerful. And the Tlapa is known to be a region where there's a lot of resources, especially gold. So up until now, there is a lot of gold mines that have been exploited by Canadian mining companies and Chinese as well. So what you see here, this is, for example, one of the squares that in the original codex, they are drawn. So it's painted on a matte paper. And in this case, I decided to make it as a kind of a version of adobe. So it's cold earth mixed with different elements and with fiber. So these small squares that you see, all this is gold, this is gold, this is gold. So everything is gold in different formats. So they were like small sheets of gold. And each of these squares represented 1/4. So let's say every 4 months, there was someone from the Mexica Empire who came to ask for the tribute. So all these elements are gonna be installed on the walls of a patio. And this is, for example, one of the pieces which is still fresh. This is the hanging system. I will show you one which is unfortunately broken, so that's why I can turn it around so you can see how it works. And now I will show you how our fantastic team from Cooperación Comunitaria is working. So this is how we are preparing the arcilla and the different fibers. They are being pressed into a wooden mold. And afterwards, we add a mesh that gives a structure to the whole procedure. And then we have different stamps with the motifs, which are then pressed into the clay. And then we dry them, we let them dry. So it's a very meticulous process. Here we are preparing the mesh, and I'm gonna walk you outside so you see how the earth is been put together. This is the material that we also brought from Tlapa, from the region where I did the original project. So this is the version I'm doing at the museum, is the second instance of the project I did in Malinaltepec in 3 centers for the training of teachers in the Mepa language. And this is a version that is gonna be installed here at the museum for the exhibition. So these are the walls of the museum, which are very much concrete, quite the opposite from what we are actually doing. So it's gonna be an interesting contrast. And well, I thought it would be interesting to show this process because of what Brooke was mentioning of the collaboration with different kinds of ethnographic museums, also the conflicts that are attached to that decision. As you know, the Humboldt Forum, it's a very controversial project in Germany, and there has been a lot of discussion about what it means to keep all these artifacts in museums, in libraries, and how the original communities have or have no access to these resources. And in this case, through the process of making this piece, there was like a different kind of dialogue with the community that is not just related with bringing a facsimile of the codex or giving them a link to see it on the internet, but it's more like installing it on the walls of a place where people were visited every day. So I'm very, very happy that we are able to do this piece here for the museum at MOAC. I'm also very happy that because of the pandemic, we are able to actually install a real exhibition. It's almost like a dream. And yeah, I think that's all I want to say. Maybe when we start the discussion, we can point out on different elements which are more relevant to the discussion on repatriation and cultural heritage and how do we deal with that as artists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was amazing. It was so great watching it happen. live. Thank you for showing us. It's very exciting. I was going to ask as well, it's a really big show, right? Like the show you had in Germany was, it was looking at lots of different bodies of work. So this is a major show as well.
Yeah, it's a very big exhibition. It's more like the last 20 years of my practice. In the case of Germany, it was a lot of works that had been already produced before. But here in Mexico, we are actually making a lot of things or redoing them on site. So yeah, it's very exciting because I didn't have an exhibition in Mexico City, a solo exhibition for a long time. So I'm very happy to be able to share this with the audience also from the university, which is a very special place, my alma mater.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to send all my family and all my people to see it. I can't wait to see it. So I guess starting with the discussion now, thinking about these two presentations, I mean, you know, it's really hard to distill all of the thinking that you guys go through into smaller questions, but you know, you both break away from dominant historical narratives to bring forward alternative narratives that, you know, are off the radar, that have been hidden or invisibilized. And I think in your own ways, you both challenge the strength, the force, and the legitimacy of a historical system. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say. But I wanted to ask, I guess, how do you see yourself and your practice in relationship to history, the history that you're dealing with? Do you see yourself as an opposing force? Is it a complementary force? Is it a decolonial force? Is it a form of institutional critique? Is it a bit of all of them? I don't know. I would love to know how you think about that.
Mariana, thank you so much. I'm so excited to see that and to be, you know, in that practice of making and installing. And thank you, Ivan. Yeah, I mean, I think they're really great questions. I think that for me, it's about a process of yindyamara. And yindyamara, it's a Wiradjuri word that means taking time and respectfully going about life in a way that is not about rushing things. And in some ways, you know, it's been a struggle to like accept and understand the decolonial process, because there are some Indigenous and other peoples that believe and use that word, but some of us choose to use other words and other ways of doing things within that space. And I think that something that I've been getting closer to over the last 10 years of my practice, and also working with source communities and my own communities around healing. And well, what does that mean? You know, and I think that the complexity around the Humboldt Forum that Mariana talks about, I remember when I was in Berlin, and, you know, and the whole controversy about them reinstating many of the, you know, the exhibitions and stuff. I think the question you ask is kind of complex, right? Because I think that sometimes we're always in the firing line to kind of like just be who we are. But then when you're being who you are in this kind of dominant space, it's somehow politicized. And I don't think that that's, I'd like to see that shift a little bit. So it's more about, you know, viewpoints of seeing.
Yeah, I think I find it quite remarkable that you have both collaborated with, you know, such a huge amount of institutions outside of contemporary art, and that you've plunked into their collections, and that they've, you know, it's opened doors for you to kind of look at things and rethink them. And this is, you know, natural history museums, ethnographic museums, and also, I guess, interact and have relationships with all of the disciplines that inform these institutions. And I guess like a question that it's part of the same question, really. It's like there's this colonial European DNA, and given the nature of both of your work, I think you know, it's quite a remarkable thing. And but I guess maybe, yeah, I'd love to know, have you ever encountered a lot of pushback when you're trying to upset the order of things? Maybe Mariana, would you mind answering this one first?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the process is not easy. I think it has shifted also in the past years. I think maybe 15 years ago, it was very difficult to approach a natural history museum or an ethnographic museum as an artist and propose a collaboration because they were not used to it. So they didn't know how to handle it. And also me as an artist, I also learned how you need to start this conversation, because you cannot just enter and say, I want to upset the order of things, you know, because that's what they do. They order things constantly. And it's also a lot of things that I needed to learn about their process and the different professions and the whole structure of what a museum is, because a contemporary museum is very difficult, very different from an ethnographic museum or a historical museum. They have totally extreme opposite mechanisms of functioning. But I found that amazing collaborators that I kept on working all over the years. And I also found very difficult moments. And I also made a lot of mistakes. And especially in the last years, when these collaborations, like the museums started to make them on purpose, to invite artists to work with them, I think things became even more complicated, because before it was my own initiative. So I would go to the museum and say, I'm an artist, and they would say, what is that? We have no idea what an artist is. And then you need to start the whole structure from the bottom. But now they already have an idea of what an artist is and what they want from an artist. So, and there's also a political aspect and an aspect of representation. Also, how much you want to acknowledge to the museum structure. And if the museum invites you, then you lose your critical tools. You know, you cannot say I'm being critical because I've been invited by this museum. So I think the power structures have shifted a lot. And in that sense, my position as an artist has also shifted, because I'm not in a clear position anymore. I'm sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other side. For example, in this case, I am working with Cooperación Comunitaria in Guerrero, but at the same time, I have a work which is similar at the Humboldt Forum. So it's a totally opposite situation. It's even a contradiction. So for me, it has been challenging to learn. I'm still learning or finding a way how to deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, I find that fascinating, but I understand that there has to be like a silver lining, and I don't know, maybe I think that you have to believe that there is some change happening in these institutions from the inside. And I mean, we've definitely seen a huge institutional change of attitude of, I mean, beyond institutional critique. It seems to me that it's like a reckoning with what these institutions are and what they've done in the past and how they're changing towards the future. I don't know, Brooke, how do you feel or share this sort of hope that some of these institutions are also changing the way they do things, and that you're kind of contributing in a sense, or what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, Mariana, I agree with everything you say. I think that, you know, over the last, especially the last 5 years, things have been changing dramatically, because the context of the museum, especially the ethnographic museum, is antiquated. It's like, what is its usefulness? Anthropology has been dispersed. We know that, you know, the doctrine of primitivism and anthropology is a farce. It's about, you know, the history of colonization and wealth making, and, you know, we all know that story. And so there is this urgency for those museums to be relevant. And I think that, you know, the biggest thing about that kind of relevancy is about how they can be useful. Yeah. And it's really interesting. I work with Verhaver, you know, the curatorial group from Croatia. I think it was back in 2015 or something. And they did an exhibition at the Reina Sofia called Really Useful Knowledge. And it was a great opportunity to work in a contemporary space where I accessed the different ethnographic and other museums, and the curators and the anthropologists in those ethnographic museums were so desperate to work with contemporary artists, because they needed us to kind of reevaluate this material. material, you know, and they wanted to kind of expose these histories that they themselves, especially the younger generations, felt very uncomfortable about, and they mirrored, you know, the things that happened in Australia and other colonized nations, and their realities. But, you know, it's also problematic because, you know, back home, you know, some of our family members or others might not understand that process, or us ourselves, we put ourselves in danger. I don't think it's a very clear or clean thing. And like as Mariana said, sometimes, you know, you have one perspective and depending on that museum, and then you have another. But if you are going to kind of mention the word silver lining, I think that one experience I had about a silver lining was working again, as I mentioned, with the University of Vienna, and we, Katharina Matiasek and I, you know, she showed me these photographs from, you know, the early 20th century Baba Rudolf Posch, who was an Austrian anthropologist who went to Australia to collect Aboriginal human remains, and went to a very specific community in Grafton, north of Sydney, and took lots of photos and actually wrote down the names of the people. Now, this is very important because many people who got their photos taken, they were nameless, unknown. It was just documenting the specimen, or had numbers. Unfortunately, like in Nazi camps or in, you know, in the killing fields, etc., very similar processes of documentation, and many without real names. But the wonderful silver lining, I suppose, about working with Katharina was that we, you know, she showed me these photos. I went back to Auntie Roberta Skinner from that Grafton community. Those community members have those photos, and they're using them in Aboriginal land claim now. You know, they can actually name the people, they can see the people, their own ancestors. They never saw those photos before. And so that for me is a silver lining. And I think that when that happens and the museum starts to realize there's a shift in not only power, but authenticity of humanity. I know these are huge, you know, kind of concepts because we're not used to them, right? We're not used to being so generous. But I think for me, that's the sort of thing that gets me out of bed in the morning.
It sort of seems like there's like a balance of pros and cons, like an unavoidable balance of those things. I guess I wanted to ask about heritage and identity, because I know it's a very important part of your work, Brooke. I think representation, you know, I've read that when you were young, you just didn't see yourself in the media. And, you know, you often incorporate your heritage into your work, but you also work with other artists and you collaborate and you incorporate their heritage into your own work. And I guess this question is more geared towards Mariana. I know you're very passionate, Mariana, about your heritage as well, about your Mexican heritage, and you often incorporate pre-Hispanic history and knowledge and objects. But I wanted to ask you how specifically you look at your own heritage and identity in the context of your work.
Thank you. I think I have a very contaminated heritage, so I cannot say that I belong to a specific indigenous group, or I don't know, or I have not been able to trace it. I think it's also something that happened in Mexico through migration, through groups of people moving all over the country, and also also the people prefer to hide their indigenous backgrounds or heritages. So I cannot really trace it. So identity for me is something that I need to construct every day, and it's something that it's complex. It's not like a monolithic identity that I can carry with me and use it as a shield or something that I can protect myself. It's more like a sponge or a porous structure. And I think it's the same approach that I have to historical objects or to the places or to the people where I work. I prefer not to judge them or to define them immediately in terms of identity. That's what I would say. I think what you were talking about, the kaleidoscopic approach, it has to do a little bit with that, with accepting that there's an airplane coming. I wait a bit. Yeah. So I don't know. I have difficulties defining myself in terms of identity.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I could relate to that coming from Mexico, because, I mean, on the one hand, it seems like culture it's much less multicultural, or it seems like it can be much more homogenous, and people have less clarity of like where they stand in the spectrum of like white European and indigenous Mexican, and it's all become a bit blurry over the years. And so it's a very different discourse to what we see in Australia. But yeah, I mean, I find that very, very fascinating. I guess I might just do one last question that I really wanted to chat about, and then we might start getting through the questions. And this one is more on the lighter side, because I know that you know, beside bringing all these important narratives out and resisting the narratives of dominant historical systems, there's also a sense of play in both of your practices. There's also you know, a sense of misbehaving, objects misbehaving, or there's a bit of whimsy, or Mariana, you described like surrealism in your practice, or a surrealist influence. And you know, I have lots of memories with Brooke as well about coming into collections and just completely turning them on their head. Like you know, at the MCA, he had 2 collection works, video works, shouting at each other, TV against the TV, and you know, no one really knew what to do with it. And then in the Van Abbe Museum, you know, he turned a Picasso on his side and had a painting by Anselm Kiefer hung in the reverse. And, you know, equally, Mariana, you know, you have ceramic forms floating through the gallery space, and, you know, a rebozo that is meant to be, you know, in the scale of our body. You've done an 8-meter long rebozo that is going up in the gallery walls and down. And I think there's a lot of, there's opportunities for this other side, which is fantastical. There's a sense of discovery and a sense of, and, you know, space for sense of humor as well. So I guess, yeah, on that note, I wanted to hear your thought about these kind of like more serendipitous moments where you found new things, or you found joy in being playful within your work.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and share my screen for just like 1 minute, 30 seconds or something, because you know, one of my favorite things, here it is. I mean, you know, it's so funny. I was going to show this. This is iconoclastic, you know, work with Nick Aikens, the Van Abbe, and you know, there's Picasso on its side, Bustafan, and there's fabulous Wilfredo Lam up there, the Cuban artist. And you know, we worked with the conservator to turn the Bustafan Picasso on its side, because, you know, I just wanted the perspective to shift, and I needed some humor. And also, you know, often indigenous and other objects, you know, are turned upside down, or, you know, like put in the wrong position, or they just don't make any sense, or they're played at the wrong time if it's music, or if it's, you know, just contextually wrong. And you can see a slight shadow behind Wilfredo Lam's painting there, because it's also leaning down on a 20-degree angle, which is like leaning down, looking at Bustafan. And then you have the back of Ansel Kiefer's work there, and here it is, the other side. And I wanted to put it on this bench like it was this kind of ping pong kind of thing. And I remember speaking with a couple of you know, curators about it, like only one actually, really, you know, who was not like kind of, why are you doing that for? You have to ask the artist permission. And it's like, okay, should we apply that to everything else?
It's amazing. I also remember from this Taboo exhibition we worked together, you walked in with briefcases full of your own archives of things, uncatalogued, just like packed, and gave it to the registers. And I just remember their faces when they looked at all of these things, and they're like, wow, we need to catalog this chaos and somehow grab all of this and order it in a certain way that makes sense inside of here. So it's a funny memory that I'll cherish, take with me. Upsetting the order of things in the museum. Thank you, Brooke. And Mariana, I was wondering if you wanted to say something about these the surreal moments, the untethering these objects from their previous lives.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk about the sense of transformation and metamorphosis. And I think I use this methodology quite often to transform. I love making copies of everything and make them big and small and transform them in different materials. So also take away the aura of these ancient devices or technologies and convert them into other things, which are new, which are old, which are a mix of different sources and building techniques. So for me, it's also a lot to do with the manufacturing. For example, the piece that I show you now, that the original is a drawing on a paper and now it became a clay mural. So there is no connection between these two techniques, but at the end you create a new object that has some kind of elements from the original become something else. So I love this jumping of metamorphosis of things becoming something else and something else and something else until the end, until nothing is unique and nothing is original.
It's amazing. Yeah, that reminds me of the castings that you've done and the estelas and these big rocks with sculptural surfaces on them, and how archaeologists used to make impressions of them, but then those impressions were not considered valuable. And then eventually the object disintegrated and the impressions, are more valuable in describing the object itself. So there's that echo and this thing of the reproduction of the original, which is, it's pretty beautiful. Sorry, we are going to move to questions now. We'll have to be a little bit brief, but let me begin with a question by Fernanda Partida. I'm having a little trouble formulating this question, but I'm interested in the different ways you each have described bringing the language of objects and space to life. Brooke by embodying them through actors and a full-scale theater production, Mariana by using clay from the earth and more abstract geometric forms, in contrast with the built concrete architecture of the museum. Can you say more about why these were the forms you chose to articulate what these objects have to say? I don't know which one of you would like to answer this first.
Mariana, would you like to go first?
Okay, I can say something. I mean, I can come back to what I was mentioning about the transformation of techniques. And in the case of this piece, the geometric figures were already originally in the document. So I didn't change them or I didn't make new motifs. But yeah, I think I would just say again that it's about the transformation of certain elements and how you manage to create a new object or a new experience. And I think maybe that's also what Brooke is doing with the theater plays, like to transform a building into a character or to transform a wallpaper into a painting and to change the order of a painting and make it possible to read it in a different way. So it's a game. It's a game of shifting things in different positions.
Yeah, and I think that also the way the use of language, I think, is very important. For example, Ngawul Maragumira is the word for powerful object. And I mean, they're kind of some, not just always straight translations, because Ngawul, the word power for power and powerful can be used in many different ways, but I think it's about empowering that process and empowering that object and its relationship to me and my family members and other people. And I think that goes way beyond just the kind of the passive way of looking at objects in a museum. When I was, for example, so of course, these, characters were definitely influenced by, and like the Golani, the tree, and named by my experience with certain objects in museums, but then the practical implementation of them being words in a play and working with the third year students and master's students. There are only 3 Indigenous people in the whole cohort of about 17 actors. And the non-Indigenous actors, and even one of the Indigenous ones, had difficulty actually speaking the language. They didn't want to speak the language. They were a younger generation. And then I had to work with Auntie Carolyn Briggs, who is a traditional owner of Naarm, which is Melbourne. It's not my traditional country. And she had to invite them in to say, it's okay that we're speaking Indigenous languages. And I think that this is really part of a much larger effect, and people, that's happening in the world. I know I'm going to say something that is more complex than what it sounds, and it's definitely not yeah, I mean, like the woke movement, for example, really came out of a way of wanting to be awoken. But in actual fact, I think that in some generations or some situations, it's actually created problems. And so some of the students didn't actually want to speak the language because they found it was offensive to speak an Indigenous language, even though they had an Aboriginal elder saying, no, you have to speak this language, like you would go to France and ask for a croissant or something like this. And so there was a whole process of unpacking the kind of really embedded systemic intergenerational problems that are not only embedded in objects and how we see them, but how we rename them, or how we kind of bring back the naming of them. And I think that it's really wonderful for you to share, Mariana, what you're doing there in regards to, the gold and those kind of histories, because people, for us, they're not really that far away, those histories. They are intergenerational, and that takes a very long time, hundreds of years, to kind of unpack these. So I think that even for myself as an artist, to work with an object, call it an object, get to, actors to kind of speak a language that they think that they shouldn't speak because they're being sensitive about it, is actually the opposite. So I think that these are kind of complex times, but they're very, very interesting, very interesting.
Thank you, Brooke. We have time for one more question. This question is from Catalina Lozano. Apart from the physical restitution of objects and human remains, what other aspects could be taken into account in the discussions surrounding heritage? Mariana, would you like to answer this, or?
Yeah, thanks, Catalina, for the question. Yeah, I think maybe taking back what Brooke was saying, it's not about the object. So what is an object? Maybe we are the ones in the Western world that define these things as objects, but maybe they're much more than that. And the idea of restitution and repatriation is very much material based, but I believe that there are many more gestures that should be performed, both in the original communities, in the museums, and in us as artists, as humans, in how we approach the world, how we create environments, how we create cultural ecosystems where we learn to be more gentle. So it's not about violent acts, but it's about starting a dialogue. And I think repatriating an object without a dialogue doesn't bring much. There needs to be a conversation. And once the object is gone from the original museum, let's say, this absence should be visible. So there should be a place in the museum for all these absences. And they should be also articulated, because even if they repatriated the object, they have this gesture in the history of their institution. So I think the absence, and also, for example, many indigenous communities, they claim or they ask the museums not to show certain objects. So the role of obscurity, the role of the invisible should be much more articulated. It's not just about exposing things, but it's also about respecting what needs to be kept secret, or what needs to be not said, or what is not visible anymore.
That's beautiful. And I think it relates also perfectly to what you were saying, Brooke, the word that means like taking your time, doing things in a different way, being considerate with how you have an impact in the world, how you interpret the world, how you act on the world. And look, I think that's I'll conclude now, but I want to say this sort of thinking, I have a real deep admiration for both of you. You know, you practice and you work as close to my heart and my research and my path. And I just find your perspectives really enriching and very valuable. So I thank you both again for being here tonight, and thank you for your generosity.
Thank you.
Mandangu.
And hopefully we can all have coffee someday or meet in the real world. Fingers crossed.
For sure.